Well, if you're anything like me, you like toys. And really, when it comes down to it, the only thing better than a toy is the same toy, but with a removable hat. I mean, being able to take off a character's hat is actually a lot more meaningful than we sometimes realize. Such a common feature can actually make or break the publicity of a movie. And figures have been held back for this very reason, simply because when you take the hat off, sometimes the reveal is just too much. Heck, this figure came carded with the reveal. So, yeah, spoiler alert for anyone who wants to see the new Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Phantasm. Bleh, what a word. Phantasm. Okay, so figures, hats, lots of toys have had hats. It's hard to go back and say what was the first manufactured toy to have a hat. You're probably going to have to go back to the early 1800s, maybe even the 1700s, and you're most likely looking at a doll. But let's really get into the last century, the 19th century, where toys, especially after the 1960s, became about plastic, and that's what got us to action figures. Dolls, on the other hand, with soft goods, hats probably there from the very beginning. Baby bonnets, removable sailor hats, cowboy hats, the whole nine yards. But when toys became plastic in the 1960s, it was different. Hats could now be plastic, figures could now be plastic, and there's a big part of play pattern around this. Now you might look at Mr. Potato Head and say that's the quintessential figure with a hat, but, well, the version from the 1960s was a little bit less man and a little bit more potato. Although I guess you could still consider it a removable hat, you just happen to be like actually inserting it into a vegetable. Wait, are potatoes vegetables or like legumes? They grow underground. That's a nut. I'm not that good at botany. Alright, so the very first action figure was G.I. Joe, at least, according to Wikipedia. You could look at, some of those Superman dolls from the 40s and say that they're action figures, even though they're made of wood, because, why can't an action figure be made of wood? It means you're a witch, right, if you're made of wood. Okay, so yeah, G.I. Joe, kind of a male Barbie, lots of accessories. You could dress him up, put on hats, put on uniforms, but that did become a big different play pattern, because getting to dress a character up and make him your own, or her, whatever the character is very empowering. And when you get to the 1970s, now we get into things like Mego. Yes, you could actually have removable hats on all of the Mego type figures. And again, though, we're still dealing with cloth outfits, much like the G.I. Joes. We haven't yet gotten to plastic figure with plastic hat, if you will. That's removable. Mego was notorious for several of the figures having removable hats, like Thor here, who, if you removed his helmet, you could comb his lovely, beautiful blonde locks to your life's content. And let's just say lots of people didn't do that. On the other hand, Oliver and Green Arrow didn't get locks. Now, one of the more interesting Mego items they did was the secret identity outfits. So these weren't action figures, but rather accessory packs that came with the outfit and an alternate head. So here you have, for the very first time, a separate head that you're plugging on an action figure. And the extra heads didn't even come with a body. You were required to own a Mego figure in order to enjoy turning them into this character. But what's really significant about this pack is for the first time you now have not just a hat that's removable, like Green Arrow or Thor, but the head itself. And honestly, the head could really be plugged into almost any character. You don't actually have to have Spider-Man in order to plug in the Peter Parker head. You could just as much put the Peter Parker head on Iron Man. Granted, you'll have Iron Man's body. But since most of the characters did have removable outfits, yeah, Clark Kent could be Clark Kent, but the body underneath didn't have to come from your Superman doll. Could have come from any number of characters. There we go. Got the words out in the right order. All right. So we're still playing dress up with the figure, but we've gotten to removable heads. So we've taken a big leap forward as to this, feature. And at this point, you have to look about the whole question of dolls versus action figures. Is something with soft goods a doll? Is something with rooted hair a doll? Well, I did a whole video about this, and in the end, while dolls and action figures are very, very similar from a structure standpoint, it's all about, really, the play pattern. So they're virtually the same as far as a physical object, representation of a human body, can hold things, you can change their outfits, maybe change their heads, act out fantasy, incorporate them with play sets or dream houses, castles or houses or snake pits. But it's really just about how you play. So, She-Ra can be an action figure, She-Ra can be a doll. Heck, Spider-Man could be a doll. The very first Superman toy was called a doll, that wooden articulated one I mentioned. You can go back and see the video I did on that. Alright, so, doll and action figure, same thing, just about how you play with it. But in the late 70s, early 80s is really then when we get our next big change. In the 60s, plastic toys, fully plastic toys, tended to be non-articulated. Things like, the Army Men, or there were a lot of dinosaur toys in the 1960s. Sci-fi robots, obviously, once we landed on the moon, we started getting stuff like Major Matt Mason, who was a rubber body with a removable helmet, so that was a big thing. And as the 70s continued, we also saw the emergence of the larger scale action figures, the Big Jim and all of his, descendants, which leads all the way to Max Steel. You can go watch the video I did on that, too. It's a whole interesting story. And you shouldn't discount the Fisher-Price Adventure people from the late 70s. I really need to get around to doing a video on these guys. Removable hats, no removable heads, unless you pull tight enough. Any toy has a removable head if you really pull, but one that's supposed to be removable is what we're talking about here. So I got to do a whole video on the Adventure people, but very significant as far as plastic articulated figures that had removable helmets. So what's so significant about this, or bad or good about this? Well, for that, kind of have to examine Star Wars. And Star Wars gave birth through its 3 3/4 size, which came from Adventure people in a way, then led to the next generation, Mask. I know, Star Wars, G.I. Joe, Mask, I'm drawing some conclusions here, but bear with me. Mask was a toy line that was all about removable helmets. That was the play pattern. And it's what made Mask so cool. There was just something really awesome about getting to take your Matt Tracker figure and put that mask on, and suddenly he was armored up, and his vehicle could then transform. Obviously, it was all in your imagination. And this, call it cool surprise moment in a toy, made its way to Star Wars finally in the Return of the Jedi line. So Leia as Boushh, probably the more, armored up Leias, if you will, especially, for a line they're aiming at young boys, armored characters sell better. And, this was one of Leia's coolest moments, and it was one of the cool reveals in the movie. You didn't expect this was Princess Leia dressed up as a bounty hunter infiltrating Jabba's palace. Why am I explaining the plot of Return of the Jedi like you guys haven't seen it? So yeah, you could pull off the helmet, and granted, it tended to scrape the hair off after a few thousand times, but there was something inherently mysterious and empowering about this, about being able to turn one character into another. The same thing with Mask, where by putting Mask, meaning the toy line, where you put the helmet on. It worked a little bit when you had things like just not a full face mask, but a helmet, like with Endor Leia. And what was especially cool about this figure is if you remove not just the helmet, but you removed the outfit and the belt, you got this Leia, the one from Home 1 there. So 2 Leias in one, simply by removing the hat and removing the cape or the cloak, or the outer layer of clothing, if you will. And you get Endor Leia, or you get Home 1 Briefing Leia. Pretty cool. This has actually been replicated in the modern Hasbro line a few times, even with the new Vintage series. Unfortunately, the counterpart to Endor Leia, Endor Luke, didn't quite get this because, well, if you remove his hat and you remove his cloak, you still wind up with his hat on because it's sculpted. But again, completely different body underneath. That's the Death Star 2 look versus the Jabba's Palace look. So it's a shame the helmet wasn't removable because, again, you would have gotten a twofer out of this Luke. There were a few other figures with the removable helmet, call it gimmick. Lando Calrissian in his skiff guard disguise is definitely one of them. And again, I had this figure, I had the Leia, both, and the Leia's Boushh, the Endor. Pulling the helmets on and off was just, it was magical. I remember just making Star Wars figures so much cooler. The last one to get this feature was the Luke from Power of the Force 1. That was from 85, the ones that came with the coin for his Luke and Stormtrooper. We never got kind of the obvious one, which feels like it would have been Darth Vader, right? Because of all the characters in the entire Star Wars movie, who's more about having his mask removed than, Vader? The whole sort of premise of the 3 movies, in hindsight, is, learning who he is. Teased in Empire Strikes Back, and then finally we get our big reveal that it's Hayden Sebastian Shaw under the mask. Thank goodness they kept that in. Now, obviously, they wanted to hold out spoilers, like in the way the cross-sell with the Ewoks used to be blacked out before the movie came out, to hold the Ewoks as the big surprise in the movie. I don't know. I thought Helmet Vader was the bigger surprise. But we couldn't get a figure in the Vintage line. We got one in the Modern line. In fact, we've gotten quite a few in the Modern line. And a big question has been asked, why did we never get one in the Kenner line? And it's twofold. One, the technology didn't exist. The head was becoming way too much of a pinhead in order to fit inside there. And two, holding back on the reveal, and the fact that after the movie came out, interest in Star Wars really waned. That's when we entered those 10 years of no Star Wars toys. Maskless Vader is now, a staple of multiple Star Wars lines because technology has improved. Toy making technology, tooling, articulation, assembly. So doing a 6-inch figure with a removable helmet, super easy, barely an inconvenience. It works because of the scale. At 3 3/4, though, we still deal with the issue of the wonkiness of the helmets. When you have a figure at this small, doing a helmet to fit on the head means the head either has to be small or the helmet has to be big. On 6-inch, on 12-inch, not so much, because at that scale you can make the helmet bigger and it doesn't feel out of place. It feels like it just works with the armor. But when you're in the smaller scale and you try to do the same thing, I remember just being so disappointed with so many figures simply because they had a removable helmet and the helmet didn't fit. That was like the worst thing. The mask figures, Boosh, the helmet just slid right on. I guess that's why it scraped the hair on Leia after a while. This was something that I first encountered professionally when I worked on the DCU Classics line, and we wanted to do 2-packs, and we had to mine what figures we already had to minimize the tooling. So we were going to pair Orion from a single release with a new Light Ray figure, but I really insisted we find a way to make Orion different, because I didn't want fans to feel like they were, just being forced to buy the same figure over and over again, because I don't like being forced to buy the same figure over and over again. So I won out, and we tooled up a new head that had a new helmet, the helmet being removable. But look at that head. I mean, it is so out of proportion with the body, but it had to be that small. And I remember talking with the Horsemen about this, and they were really concerned about how they were going to do the head and make it so the helmet could actually slip on the head or remove it for display. And, even on, it still looks a little wonky because you get like a weird gap there and, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a 6-inch figure, which it should be legitimately easier to do this at 6-inch, but easier, but not always possible. Here he is against the original release that had the helmet sculpted on, and you can see what a tight fit it is. Helmets just tend to look better when they're sculpted on. Trying to make them removable is an issue, and that brings me to exactly what I want to talk about. Joy, it only took 20 minutes to get there. All right, so this Ant-Man Marvel Legends figure, just does it perfectly. And it's not the first figure to do this, but especially the way they packed him out was really, I won't call it groundbreaking, but very significant. So you have two heads. You have the Paul Rudd head of Ant-Man, and you have the helmet. Well, he's packed out holding the helmet with the Paul Rudd face. Wow, perfect. Now, you don't put that helmet on him. Just like with Ram Man here, we did the same thing. We didn't do a pack out like that, but Ram Man came with two heads. And that's because we wanted to do the helmetless version from 2000X. And even if you position the helmet head under his arm there, you can actually kind of pull that off. We knew that making the helmet just removable wouldn't work because the head would have to be too small. Same thing with Sweet Bee. How in the world were we going to get all that hair and all those antennae, how are we going to get them inside her space helmet? No, so we did the space helmet as a separate head. This was also something that we were able to do on the Voltron line. I didn't work on this line in total, but this was one of my heavy suggestions was, instead of doing big helmets like they had in the vintage Voltron line, where the helmet, again, went over the figure's head, but unlike Mask, M-A-S-K, the toy line, Matt Tracker, Venom, that whole thing, they didn't fit perfectly. So for the modern Voltron line that was paying homage, one of the things I was able to suggest to the team that was carried forward was doing two different heads. And there was concern about whether it could be pulled off on a 3 3/4 figure, or if pulling on that head was going to break it. It didn't. It worked perfectly. And you could have two complete sets of figures, or you could buy the same one and choose to pose it with the helmet or the helmetless. So I kept just feeling like, okay, we proved it with 3 3/4 figures. When are we going to get this with Star Wars? There's so much potential with doing swappable heads. And then finally in late 2021, early 2022, Bo-Katan from The Mandalorian / Clone Wars / Ewok Adventure, she has a fully removable head. Her helmet and a regular head both have a ball joint in them, So you could swap them and have her helmet look or her helmetless look perfectly without getting the pinhead of Orion or the floppy hats of Mego Thor. To me, this is the way to do it. If you look at her 6-inch figure, it works with a helmet. But at 3 3/4, doing two different heads to make sure the helmet is flush and not oversized, that is absolutely the way I feel it should go. Now, dressing up a character with a new head or a new hat can feel like a, sort of cheap way of re-releasing the same figure, but the head brings 90% of the character to an action figure. And a hat can even add to that, and making them both removable. So you've got a head, it was like Whoosh basically came with two heads. One just slipped over the other. But if you don't have something that can just slip over the head, you actually need to have a helmet that fixes with the hair, well, it might be better instead of doing a hat and a regular one, just to make the head removable. Of course, then you wind up with a giant bag full of heads and struggle what to do with them. That's not, macabre in nature. And, I guess you could, line them up around Castle Grayskull and put them on pikes or something. Anyway, what do you guys think? What's the best way to do helmets? What's the best way to do masks? What's the best way to improve value of figures? Is it alternate heads or is it, shiny, shiny hologram stickers? You tell me. See you in the comments below, and thanks for watching.